Conversations about Nigeria's revenue sharing formula dates back many, many years. How far so far? Let's begin from Abuja. Akwe.
Oh yes, we're starting a discussion indeed on the revenue sharing formula debate, and joining us right now in our studios here in Abuja is Associate Professor Nazifi Daruma, who is a development economist and a senior lecturer at the University of Abuja. You're welcome to Sunrise Daily.
Good morning, Mafia, and good morning, Nigerians. A little point of correction. I am a full professor of development economics and public finance, University of Abuja.
So I think we should say congratulations to you.
Thank you very much.
Indeed. Now, you have seen the debate. You've heard the governors of the PDP there. We've also seen the conversation that happened earlier this year with the NFI. You're trying to step into the debate as to whether or not local governments were getting their full share and were autonomous enough. Now, they addressed the particular issue and said that no PDP governor has been indicted, but they also called for a review of the revenue sharing formula. Now, we know that since 1989, when the Revenue Mobilization and Fiscal Allocation Commission was founded, as a result of many other commissions that had preceded it, very little has been done in reviewing the formula. In times when they've actually had the meeting to review the formula, it has hardly ever happened. It has only stopped at the level of recommendations. Now, we understand that the federal government is now, or that this particular body is meeting again to set up a committee to see how they can review the revenue sharing formula. Some people say that's not what we should be looking at. That we should be looking to increase what actually comes to the basket instead of reviewing the revenue sharing formula. What's your view on what's been going on?
Well, you know, in a federation like ours, with 3 tiers of government, and with a very distorted monocultural economic orientation and over-concentration and reliance on oil as a source of revenue, there's always a tendency for continuous acrimony, particularly from subnational entities, towards getting more of the share from what is accruing to the federation account, mainly from mineral oil wealth. Now, I have heard the statement made by one of the governors relating to the fact that there is simply no diversion of local government funds on the part of PDP governors. But let me say with every due respect that that statement is wrong, that statement is not right. There is bipartisan commitment or bipartisan committing of such illegality across PDP governors, across APC governors. And why does this happen is because there is a lacuna in our 1999 Constitution, which unfortunately indirectly places the local governments under the control of the state government. And you know, the Constitution is the supreme guide that defines our relationship at individual level, at corporate level, at institutional level, at governmental level. And so because of that lacuna, there is a broad understanding of what actually goes to the local governments. And unfortunately, because our economic management structure is such that the subnationals are deeply not structured enough to generate enough revenue, expand their economies base, and that is why there is this continuous acrimony for trying to get much revenue from the federation account. And one fundamental thing, Maope and good Nigerians, that we need to understand is that in all the years of this continued agitation for increased devolution of resources to the subnational entities, there is no sufficient or concomitant increase or expansion in institutional and accountability framework, particularly at the state level, to guarantee that the additional revenue accruals will be justifiably used in order to improve the lives of the people of this country. We know in this country, whether in PDP or APC states, the recklessness with which the economies of subnationals have been managed is such that in 2015, several states cannot be able to pay salary. The federal government have to bail out the state with amounts over 100 billion. In fact, the federal government has to be proactive because of that problem to see to the fact that they use refund of Paris Club refund and give to so many of the states. And unfortunately, it is a record, verifiable record, that a number of the states, including PDP and APC states, some of the governors diverted those monies away from the purposes for which it has been made. And if you look at the debt profile of the state, you look at the trajectory of resources going to the state, particularly the oil-producing states that have additional 13% derivation going to them, there is simply no justification for any of those states to be owing any worker or pensioner. Now, in the context of the present revenue allocation formula, in the context of the present glaring inefficiency and lack of transparency and management at subnational level, what justification do we have to devolve more resources to the state in order to improve the conditions of people now that they were not able to sufficiently utilize that? And remember, at federal level, the institutional framework for clear separation of powers between the federal, state, and local government, between the legislature, executive, and judiciary is sufficiently grounded in such that National Assembly do at points in time exercise its oversight responsibility on the executive, and the judiciary at the federal level is sufficiently independent. But remember, it is only of recent that the president has made moves based on the recommendation of constitutional amendment to give monies belonging to state judiciary directly and monies belonging to state houses of assembly directly. So the institutional framework in the state of providing the needed check on the executive is simply not there. So devolving more resources to subnational entities without sufficiently improving the institutional capacity of the legislature and the state houses of assembly, and the judiciary to do their function and checkmate the excesses of the executive, and then clearly giving full financial autonomy to the local government as a basis at the most closest tier of government, I don't in any way support increasing any single 1% derivation or devolving of more resources to subnational entities.
I see the point that you make there, Prof. But before we go ahead, to dissect the points that you have made, let me take you up on the accusation which you made against state governors, saying that indeed none of them is innocent in touching the funds belonging to local government, and this is across party lines,
yes,
if I get you correctly. That might be the impression out there. They have said that they don't have anything. Do we have, if we have proof otherwise, for instance?
I told you earlier,
yes,
there is a serious lacuna in our constitution. And that constitution literally provided a basis for the joint account framework. And the joint account framework is such that monies accruing to the local governments should go into that joint account. And the constitutional provision provided for a certain proportion of the internally generated revenue of the state governments to be put into that account for the purpose of funding local government. In theory, that is what happened. But in reality, the money is used otherwise. And you know, in Nigeria, people can use administrative technicalities to do things in a way that go out of the way. Go to any single local government in Nigeria today. The only activity that you see noticeable is when there is an allocation that comes from the federation account, payment of salaries, and then small amount is given usually to the local government. And remember, across the party line, most of the state governors refuse to conduct election into local governments. There are states that have had caretaker local governments for upward of 3 or 4 years and then continuously renewing it. Now, because, as I said, you see,
some states argue, and I'm not holding brief for the states. Some states argue that, conducting elections are really expensive. We are going to be spending money that we do not have. That's what they were, that's part of the argument. It doesn't then mean then that they have pilfered the fund belonging to local governments, or that states or state governors have touched the funds belonging to local governments. They can as well give the funds belonging to local governments to the caretaker committees.
Maopi?
Yeah.
How can anybody be appointed as a caretaker chairman of a local government and sufficiently exercise independent financial authority and say no to the government? It has never happened, and it will never happen. And because of that, you see, the argument that you have put forward, in fact, indirectly, I would accuse you of shielding some of the state governors, because the same state governors that say they don't have enough resources to conduct local government elections are the same state governors that have benefited from a consistently organized and scheduled election at the federal level that brought them to power. And the Constitution says that we have 3 tiers of government: the federal government, the state government, and the local government. It is a known fact that local governments in Nigeria have been emasculated. And therefore, I am really in support of the recent policy by the federal government to make sure that the Nigerian Financial Institute, the Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit, put out the policy framework to make sure that monies that belong to local government goes to them, and they put out the framework. But what I will suggest to them is that Nigerians, being what we are, the state governments will be able to devise strategies in order to circumvent those rules. So the Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit should up its ante and continuously review those guidelines and make new guidelines where they discover there are processes or there are evidences of circumventing those regulations.
So if
and if we want to defend democracy,
yeah.
if we actually believe in democracy, if the governors are actually democratic, they should be able to provide sufficient funding for local governments, allow the local governments to evolve as a 3rd tier of government, allow the local governments to use their resources to provide petty developmental projects, which will go a long way in devolving resources, reducing the absolute poverty at local level, because the local government are the closest people to the government. And when you provide resources at local level, a lot of significant expansion in the economy is facilitated, because for everything that is paid at the local government level, it goes within the local economy, and it reduces even issues relating to insecurity.
Okay. I'm sure you've heard our guest here in Abuja. We'll take you to Lagos now, where another guest is standing by. Back to you, Ayo and Coyote.
Oh, yes, we have with us the former chairman of Nigeria Economic Summit Group, Mr. Kyari Bukar. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
This is the current revenue sharing formula. Do you think, how developmental do you think this is?
It makes a lot of sense. Fiscal federalism requires that most of the resources or wealth and income of a nation need to go down as closer as possible to the people, to the citizens. Now, in our structure, which is a copy of what the US is, it's federal, states, and local governments, or federal, states, and counties. And therefore, majority of the monies collected need to go down as closer to the people as possible. Now, the idea actually is not a very old idea. It was defined by, I believe, Richard Musgrave, a German-American professor of economics in the late 50s or early 60s. And the argument is very simple. Taxes are collected at the federal level. I mean, if you look at the US, for example, taxes are collected at the federal level and at the states levels. But the majority of the taxes, company income tax, et cetera, are done at the federal level. And many other income that comes in, so the wealth and income of the nation is all collected. Now, the government then, at the central level, distributes it out to the state and local governments. The reason for doing that is that government has 3 functions. One is that of wealth and income distribution. And people may not like to hear that, but that's one of the key things, meaning the developmental aspects of our life, building of infrastructure, etc., etc. The second is economic stability, which should usually be done at the federal level. But when you look at the distribution, even including building of infrastructure, hard infrastructure, it's better and more efficiently done at the federal level rather than at the local level. Now, if you come to schools and healthcare and so on and so forth, it should be done at the local level. Now, the reason being that if it is closer to the people, it would be more efficient and efficacious rather than if it is done somewhere further away from the average citizen.
You said earlier that the resources ought to be closer to the people as opposed to, farther from them. Correct. Which one is, from this revenue sharing formula that is currently active, more than 50% is going to the federal government. So how is that closer to the people?
That's not the good ideal formula. We started much higher than this going to the federal. I mean, before 1999, I believe the federal government was taking over 60-something% of the total entire federation, federally collected revenues. I believe it was somewhere between 1999 and 2003 that this formula came out, including the 13% derivation. And therefore, what one would expect going further down is for the federal government to take less and more to come down. In fact, ideally, I would want it inverted, meaning that more should go to the local governments. Now, what the prof had mentioned is something that we need to pay attention to. The efficiency I'm talking about is that the citizens can determine how those resources are utilized. And that means that the local government's elections are very important. And the funds must go directly from federation account to the local governments, elected local government officials, rather than appointed. There are numerous states where I know there has not been a local government elections in the last 16, 20 years.
So let's just try to hypothesize for a moment here. We have these figures, 52.68% for federal government, 26.72% for state, 20.60% for local government. Looking at this, what do you think should be the proper? I'd like you to put figures to it.
I would put somewhere less than 40% to the federal. The less the need for people to go to Abuja, the better it is for the economy.
Okay.
And the more it is at the grassroots, the more efficient governance we are going to get at the grassroots. Now, there should be enforcement of our constitution to make certain that the state governors do not interfere with the local government funds. I.e., if I were to put 33% or thereabouts at the local government level, remember it's 774 local government units. So there are many of them distributing that 33%, if you will. And the state governments can, because, well, there are tertiary institutions and a bit of state-level infrastructure. Therefore, the state governments can stay where they are or slightly more.
Do you think that
lesser to the central government?
So do you think that will go down well with state governments?
It may or may not, but that's what the kind of governance we chose for ourselves. People do not quite get what it means to be a fiscal federalism or a federal structure. A federal structure ought to be that powers should devolve downwards as closer as possible to the peoples. It is more important. Have you noticed something? When the US president just went to Dayton, it was the mayor of Dayton that received him. The governor was there, certainly, but it was the mayor that's the most important person in that city, not even the governor. And that means that she is the closest person to the citizens. People call the mayor when there is a pipe break, when there is waste that needs to be collected, or when there is a shooting in their, in their city. So, and that basically means that power ought to be devolving down to the grassroots level. And by the way, if that's what's going to happen, and over time as people learn that it is more important to be local government chairman than to be the governor or a commissioner. So
now that we're looking at this,
right,
hypothetically speaking, this power shift, from the center to the people, there's now the issue of accountability.
Correct.
We need to put structures in place, and he mentioned it in Abuja. So how should we go about this? Put the structures in place before we do a review, or review first and structure? How?
It's going to be a combination of both. We need to ensure that people understand their power, the power of their votes and their voices. And the federal government also need to have in place structures that would make it such that the state governors are bypassed when it is an allocation that is going to a local government or to the local government's accounts. And that way, the state houses of assembly need to also assert their constitutional responsibilities, because so far I have not seen, and I may be mistaken, I have not seen state houses of assembly that may have a clash on policy matters between them and their governors. I have never seen anything that has happened other than threatening somebody with impeachment or fighting in between or amongst themselves, etc., etc.
Over the years, Mr. Buka Kerry, this conversation about the revenue sharing formula has been on, and we've, just as you said, we have undulated between figures.
Correct.
30 at some point it was actually 30% or thereabout to the federal government, then it increased to the 60 something that you said, and all of that. The challenge I see, because one of the things that one of the responsibilities of this revenue mobilization, allocation, and fiscal committee is not just to devolve money, to assign these percentages to the 3 tiers of government, but also to assign how much each person gets, who are in government, especially at the federal level and all of that. Do you see the revenue mobilization, allocation, and fiscal committee as a commission being able to do anything different from what we have? Do you see that commission empowered and capable of executing that?
The commission's powers, and I may be mistaken, I haven't looked at their act, but so far, based on what they have been doing, it suggests to me that they come back, do their study, and make a recommendation. Now, I don't know if the commission itself can actually develop, write down a bill and send it to the National Assembly. Now, if someone is making a recommendation, it can become very public. It's a political issue, and therefore all stakeholders kind of come around the table, have a conversation before it gets adopted. The last time it was adopted was during President Obasanjo's era, and there is something about him that actually makes, he made sure in those days that when something needs to be passed, he, pushes it through with a certain amount of passion and zeal, and it does happen. Now, similar discussion ought to take place here, assuming that this is a formula that we actually, as people, would want, and therefore less to the federal, or lesser to the center, more to the local. And if that is something that across the board, because remember, the senators and the House of Reps members come from local governments and smaller villages, etc.
You just said now that more to the people, less to the center.
Right.
It's a very interesting dynamic.
With us, Professor Nasivi Dharma, who is a development economist, senior lecturer at the University of Abuja. And just before we went on break, of course we were in Lagos, but before we threw it to Lagos, he did say that certain structures have to be put in place, certain checks and balances must be put in place before perhaps more funds can even go to the states, in such a way that maybe even the funds don't even go to the states. Maybe they go directly to the local government. Am I getting you right, Professor?
Yeah.
Now, some people will say that whether or not the funds go to states or they go to local governments, we're still going to be in trouble because the formula that we currently have, not just the sharing formula, but the idea that we all pull into a general resource from one major commodity and we'll share it at the end of the day is still not going to encourage the productivity we need to get going. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, there are two fundamental issues that we have raised here. Number one is the need to expand the economy to produce more, provide a basis of expanding the tax base, and therefore improving the capacity of the economy to provide revenue for the provision of social services. On the other hand, the formula as it is, there is unwieldy over-concentration at the federal government level. But be that as it may, and as I've said earlier, if you don't strengthen the institutional mechanisms at subnational entities to make sure that existing and prospective revenue that will go to the state governments and local governments are judiciously and efficiently utilized for the purpose for which it is done, then that may not be able to happen. But there is an element of prioritization. Do we change the revenue allocation formula now, devolve more resources to the state, or we first strengthen the institutional capacity of the subnationals and then tinker with the revenue allocation formula? I think the most ideal thing is to first of all strengthen the institutional capacity at subnational level to make sure that the state legislature, the state judiciary are sufficiently funded to provide the needed check and balances on the executive. And also, there's complete political, economic autonomy for the local government. Remember, at local government level, there is also what is called Local Government Legislative Council, which is supposed to provide an oversight on the elected local government chairman and the councillors. And as I've said earlier, the 774 local governments in this country represent the closest grassroots economy that we have. And unfortunately, one fundamental issue which we tend to overlook is the fact that our economy as it is structured today is extremely over-dependent on imported goods and services, or we can call it high import dependency syndrome. Now, much as we want to devolve more resources to the local government, and much as we want to devolve possibly more resources to the state, what is the capacity of the economy to retain even what we are earning, and therefore expand also the capacity of the economy to provide a basis of revenue? You see, the report that was read as part of the background report of this argument,
discussion,
put forward an argument that, local, for example, Lagos State was able to generate 300 billion over and above almost 30 states put together. But you see, local or Lagos State in particular have specific peculiarities that confer certain advantage on it, but it was also complemented with a very good governance structure, particularly at the executive level, which make it possible. Now, the question is, it is not just sufficient for you to say you want to increase taxes at the state level or at local government level, because collection of taxes is the function of economic activity existing or happening at state and local government. So the fundamental question that we need to have very holistic conversation is, the economy as it is structured, how can we expand its productive capacity? How do we produce more in Nigeria relative to importation? Look at myself, look at you, look at every single elite in this country, from his head to toe. You'll see that a significant proportion of what we wear, what we use in our household, is extremely import dependent. And in a globalized economy with a rising population that is almost 200 million, this is a fallacious, unsustainable economic arrangement and structure that we as elites, we need to sit down and have realistic and holistic conversation of how do we improve the capacity of the economy to produce locally. Because it is only with improved domestic production that you can sufficiently utilize idle resources, employ more people, generate more income, and use it as a basis of expanding the tax base and therefore providing more resources for the provision of governmental services, and therefore less reliant for each of the tiers of government on this unsustainable money coming from the fossil fuel that we sell to other countries.
Now, Prof, some people will say that, you know, this conversation we're having or the submission that you have made has been an ongoing discussion since time immemorial, especially since the discovery of crude oil and when we started experiencing the vagaries of the prices of crude oil on our economy.
Yeah.
However, this is what we have now seen. That RAPFAC is saying they want to hold this conversation on redistributing the wealth, redistributing what goes to federal, state, and local governments. This conversation is going to happen almost whether or not we like it.
Yeah.
What would you be saying happens at that committee meeting if, you know, we cannot go down the route, which seems a little more difficult in terms of looking more holistically at our economy, how we can expand resource base? What would you say should happen at the end of the committee meeting or review of the revenue sharing formula? What should happen there?
You see, the institutional framework for economic relationship between the federal government and subnational entities is provided for through the instrumentality of the National Economic Council. I have this feeling because I was formerly head of Secretariat of the National Economic Council when I was with the National Planning Commission. The ideal thing is to have a sufficient long meeting with possibly expanded membership of the National Economic Council to have like complete 3 or 4 days conversation, realistic conversation, so that at the end of the day, we fashion out an economic structure that works for everybody. And the first point of doing that is, one, to go back to the culture of national development planning. Since the abandonment of the planning culture in 1985, after we abandoned the fourth national development plan, some effort was made in 2010 through the Vision 2020 Economic Transformation Blueprint and its first national implementation plan to bring back the culture of planning. Now, a situation whereby you come to the National Assembly. The National Assembly spend valuable time discussing inclusion of projects that should have been included in National Development Plan ab initio that will have freed valuable time and resources for our legislators to continue to have proactive thinking of sufficient reorientation of our national economy to add value, generate more wealth, and generate more income. Secondly, our structure of infrastructural provision and the quantum of resources that are available to us is not sufficient. So we need to have conversation as to how we can properly cost projects by involving especially the Nigerian Institute of Quantity Surveyors. Because if you took any project, whether at federal government, at state government, at local government level, if you subject it to real costing structure provided for by the NIQS, you realize that the government could have made sufficient savings that could be used for other purposes. And our capacity to provide sufficient infrastructure in all ramifications is extremely limited based on the level of our economic activity and the limited size of the economy. So we need to expand the public-private partnership frontier by reviewing the law and reviewing the policy framework, taking into consideration a hybrid arrangement based on what happened in India, Brazil, and other countries, and domesticate it. Number 3.
Prof, I'm afraid we're totally out of time on that one. I'm going to have to leave the rest of the time to Alhaji Kyari Buka, who is our guest in our Lagos studio. But we have to thank you very much for coming on Sunrise Daily this morning. Professor Nazifi Darma is a development economist and also a senior lecturer at the University of Abuja. It's back to you guys, Kayode and Ayo in Lagos.
Thank you very much, Mr. Buka. You heard the Prof said the other time that we need to strengthen the state apparatus, the infrastructure of state. And you also talked the other time about making the local governments work so that, you know, development can come from there. How, practically, do you think that is possible in this present dispensation?
Practicality of it actually rests on each and every one of us. We give greater importance to being in Abuja rather than being in my local government or my village. And the minute that we realize it's more important to be a local government councillor, meaning that you would be more effective to your people as a local government councillor or an elected local government official rather than, say, a senator or a House of Reps. Unfortunately, the value system is such that we have inverted the importance, greater importance on being closer to the grassroots. And in any emerging economy, there is more to be done at the local government. Waste, clearing of waste, fixing of the water pipes or the water tanks, and ensuring that at the primary level of education, where most of our learning capabilities are developed as a human being, that's where the emphasis should lie.
Well, in the present dispensation, Mr. Kerry, you know that, you know, the police that we have now is such that many people pay more attention to, okay, how much are they going to get from the local governments?
And unfortunately, when we are fixated more on money, we would lose out as a society. What about what does it take for me to give in terms of my intellect, what I know, how I can help push and develop my people? And that should be something that needs to be embodied in what I call civics classes, right from early on until one reaches a formative stage in their lives, whereby it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go make the money before you come back and contribute. No, you can contribute in your own way with the skills you have. Now, the institutional aspect or developing the institutional framework is very important. Do we even follow the Constitution as it exists today at the state levels and at the local levels? Now, at the state levels, as the Prof had mentioned, there is a need for emphasis on the demarcation of powers so that the checks and balances as it exists in the center also takes place at the state level, which means that there should be tension between the executive, which is the governor, the executive function at the state level, and the state assemblies. There has to be a healthy tension as well as the judiciary. So all three tiers need to play their role. Now, the problem is if people do not have a clear idea of what they are responsible for, we cannot hold them accountable. So we make sure that they are accountable to what they are responsible for, meaning that I elected you as my assembly person at the state level. Now, you are there to ensure that you have oversight function over what the executive does, not just fold your arms and be a rubber stamp.
Well, that also brings to mind a question that some people have raised, that this sharing formula that we have at this moment is due to, of course, the commission, the Fiscal Commission would also say that this revenue formula is a product of the functions that they perceive each tier of government has to perform. For instance, the federal government has so much, the executive, the exclusive list, and all of that. Consequently, they have so many people to pay, so many things to do, infrastructure to build, just as you said the other time. Right. The states have their own, and the local governments have much less to do, unfortunately. Now, some have argued that if this revenue formula is going to be, touched, then the Constitution has to be, tinkered with as well, so that more responsibilities go to the different tiers of government.
No, what we are saying here is that if it is to be touched or restructured in such a manner that more goes to the local governments collectively, and I still stand to say that with 774, by the time you divvy it up, it's still going to be smaller compared to one entity in the middle that is taking a huge chunk, or 36 entities in the somewhere in between the two spectrum that is going to take a certain percentage, maybe a quarter of it or whatever. So at the end of the day, when you look at the resource allocation, the utilization of that, when I mean resource allocation, I mean what goes to the healthcare, what goes to, now that is better when it is closer to me and you rather than when it is esoteric. If it is a dam that needs to be built, I hope it is the federal government that's going to do it, not a local government. If it is a port or an airport, should be the federal government or a PPP arrangement or whatever, because the federal government can stand in front and attract investments, be it local or foreign. It also has the monetary powers of borrowing at a much larger scope than at the local government level. Local governments can have municipal bonds, which would be smaller in size based on their own economy. Now, the other issue that was touched, which actually I was hoping we would discuss about, and the Prof had touched in passing, is the issue of viability of the states and the local governments themselves. Now, if
we're going to get to that if you don't mind me buttoning,
right,
because
right.
one of the things that the RMAFC are also looking at, the Commission is also looking at, is increasing the revenue base of the nation. Consequent, of course, everyone has been talking about the same thing, that the states seem to be a lot more productive.
Right.
You talked on the solid mineral deposits and so many other things like that. How is that going to happen?
Well, the viability of the states need to be looked at, meaning what is the productive capacity of the states as they exist. Now, if we have an issue with, what is it, 22, 23 states that are not even able to pay salaries, let alone talk about any kind of developmental activities, then do we have a proper structure?
Is it that the states are incapable of, they do not have the potential to produce, or what?
Exactly. Do we have a proper structure? Meaning, are they viable? If they're not viable, can we go back a few steps and say, well, let's look at the geopolitical zones. Can we reduce ourselves from 36 states to 6 geozones? Which means 6 governors in the country, fewer assemblies, because the cost of governance is high. But when you look at the budgets, can you imagine the collective budget of just the legislature, whether be it at the state level or at the federal level, combine that versus if you have only 6 and 1 in the middle? There would be a huge, drastic reduction in the cost of governance.
I'm looking through social media.
Yeah.
Just a minute. And I see people are contributing, given their own formula.
Sure.
Some say, 25% to federal government, 35% to states, and 40% to local government. Some even say 5% should go to states. I mean, they can sort themselves out.
Correct.
And this is a conversation I'm glad everybody's joining in, because it has always been inevitable. I mean, see, the price of crude oil dropped below our benchmark 2 days ago, which is $60, dropped to $59. So yes, this is a time for us to really get ready for the days ahead. So the question is, on a final note, what will be your action point for people, anybody listening, individuals, governments? What should we do now?
I think people need to get in on the conversation and ensure that whether it is at town hall meetings, at the community level, to ensure that the state and people that are closer to them, whether it's at the local government level or at the state level, listen to us. And here are things that we believe would make you and us more efficient and efficacious, because the resources we have as a nation is limited, by the way. We're not as wealthy as most people think. You just have to see what other people are doing, what other countries are doing. And we're not even investing in the future. So far, whatever little we have, we tend to consume.
That is
We're
definitely
not
good.
productive. And unless we turn the narrative to be a more forward and future-looking entity, more productive entity, and how do you produce if you don't have the capacity to even manage your own resources?
That's a very tall one.
So it's a very fundamental discussion that we need
All right,
to have
well,
as a nation.
Thank you so much. Mr. Kiarubuka is the former chairman, Nigeria Economics Summit Group. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation.
You're welcome.